am Alice Parker. 42. The kind of woman people say has it all, because they can count my company's quarterly profits faster than they can count my scars. I learned early that power is a language you speak with a handshake, and a calendar not with apologies. I grew up in a small town where ambition felt like a fossil. You either left it in the dirt, or you carried it like a stone in your pocket. I chose to carry it polished and sharp, because that's how you survive being the only daughter of a mother who taught me two things: work hard, and never ask for help. Saying those facts out loud makes me sound like a business lecture, but the truth is messier behind every polished deal. There are nights I didn't sleep, dinners I left early, and a hollow place in my chest that applause never filled. So when I tell you the story that changed me, understand I am not telling it as a boardroom anecdote. I'm telling it like someone who woke up one night and realized the face she presented to the world had been stitched together to keep a private wound hidden. It begins with a spa appointment I booked because I was tired of pretending exhaustion could be polished away with boutique-scented candles. I wanted anonymity, a pocket of time where my title didn't echo in the air, and people treated me like a woman, not a brand. I wanted someone to touch the knots out of my shoulders without a press release following us. The spa was quiet, the kind of place that smelled faintly of lavender instead of ambition. He entered the room like someone who had practiced being unobtrusive. "Lucas," he said, and I remember thinking then how ordinary the name sounded against the smallness of the space. He was younger than I expected, tall enough to reach with hands that moved with measured care. He didn't ask questions, he didn't smile in a way that sought approval, he simply worked. There's a strange intimacy to letting someone map your tension. It's almost a confession without words. When his fingers found a spot near my shoulder blade, I felt something shift, a quiet steadiness, an apology in the way he pressed down and released. I asked him idly how long he'd been doing this work, and he answered in a way that should have been a throwaway line. Long enough to know what a body needed to be silent. Hearing a stranger name the exact thing I'd been chasing for years, stung and soothed me at once. I left that day lighter and annoyingly curious. By the second visit, I'd convinced myself curiosity had nothing to do with power plays. I told myself I wanted to know if anyone could be just that steady and unbothered by my suits and the permutations of my name. I might have been lying to myself. When I offered him money in a way some people make offers, bullying the world into concession, he refused. Not politely, not helplessly, flatly, no. A one-syllable answer that carried the weight of a life shaped by 1,000 small refusals. I felt something I had never felt in boardrooms: bafflement. No one had ever said no to me with such absolute calm. The laughter that followed on social media, in the whispering elevators, in the sharp amused looks of people who assumed everything could be bought, felt like a public peeling. My assistant called me to say the clip had gone viral, and for the first time I recognized a different sensation under my anger: humiliation. Not the theatrical kind that fuels a comeback, but the kind that leaks into the places you think only you can see. I reacted the way I always did: control the narrative, or at least try to. I asked for his records, his references, everything people with power do when they smell a potential threat to their image. The file was thin. He was a ghost online. No LinkedIn footprint, no curated persona. He was, by the metrics I live by, an anomaly. But anomalies have a way of unsettling people who believe in neat equations. I wanted to know why he had said no. I wanted to find the point at which refusal became a luxury reserved for the lucky. I sent investigators, I asked awkward questions in the lobby, I offered him money again dramatically. This time an envelope slipped with the same currency I spend buying silence for other people. He left it on the counter untouched, like a relic of a language he didn't speak anymore. In that moment, I felt both enraged and fascinated. I hated him and I wanted him to like me. That contradiction thrilled and terrified me. Power hadn't prepared me for being refused. It hadn't prepared me for the way my hands would tremble as I left the spa, nor for the way my reflection looked a little less like an invincible suit, and a little more like someone who had been surprised by tenderness. That surprise turned into obsession in the merciless time it takes a viral video to ripple through a city. The internet called him a hero and me a caricature. The world saw a rich woman humiliated and a modest man who had the courage to decline. Internally, what the headlines didn't capture was the ache. The quiet hollow that had been filled with status now echoing with a question, who am I? When someone says no to me, I began to follow him not as a predator, but as someone searching for the missing pieces of a private puzzle. The next morning I found myself at the spa before opening, waiting like a woman who had no map back to herself. When he finally appeared, his posture was the same, unbothered, present, immovable in the softest way. And when I asked him, not as a woman used to buying obedience, but as a woman who wanted to understand why he'd refused, his answer was simple and steady and threw me off balance. I don't sell myself. That sentence would haunt me, not because it was defiant, but because it exposed a small crackling truth about my life. In a world where everything is negotiable, refusal is its own kind of currency. After that day, the city became a map of his footprints. I told myself I was conducting discreet inquiries as any cautious executive would, a few calls here, a polite request there. But what I was really doing was learning the rhythm of a man who had refused me, and each discovery felt like a small private humiliation I could not bear to leave unresolved. I began to schedule massages under the pretense of relentless stress and insomnia, the kind of bland excuses I was used to manufacturing. Each visit I arrived in armor, different suit, a different watch, and left feeling oddly raw, like someone who had chosen to remember an old hurt, because it needed a reckoning. Lucas never treated me like the sum of the headlines. He greeted me by name, just Alice, without the crisp, careful distance other people wore. His hands were steady, his touch deliberate, never flirtatious, never transactional. He listened with a face that held no appetite for my status. The first time I asked in a voice I tried to make casual where he was from, he hesitated and then said, "A place that made me learn how to move without being noticed." It was the sort of answer that sounded like poetry because it refused to be precise. I pushed because my curiosity had become a hunger I could not name, and he shrugged. People get used to being invisible. I learned to be useful. It should have been easy to turn away after that, to let the viral clip be a gust of air that passed and left only a headline. Instead, something in me softened. I started to see the world through the lens of his quiet, how he walked, how he turned down tips without embarrassment, the way his fingers lingered on the shoulders of the elderly patrons as if anchoring them. One evening when I had stayed later than I intended, he packed his bag and we walked together down a street that smelled faintly of wet stone. He had a careful economy to his movements, a thrift I recognized only later as a discipline born of necessity. He stopped at a tiny doorway and let me peer in. The space he called home was a single room with a narrow bed, a small kitchenette, and a stack of bills tacked to the wall. There was a photograph propped against a teapot, a woman with my mother's eyes and a child curled in her lap. My throat closed. He watched me study it and not unkindly said, "She used to work 2 blocks from here. She kept us fed." I wanted to laugh at the coincidence and then felt too ashamed to. We sat on the rusted fire escape, and he told me in small fragments the shape of his life. His mother had been a seamstress at a factory contracted by a supplier that had once worked for someone connected to my company. There had been a fire, he said quietly, the kind of tragedy that gets filed under accident, in meeting minutes, and routine maintenance issue in reports. People had been paid hush money, moved to the edges of the city, and their names blotted out of the ledger. His voice did not rise. He did not curse. He simply described survival as a ledger of small compromises. When he reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and pulled out a folded page, my hands betrayed me. They reached without permission. It was a photocopy, crude and blurred, but the signature at the bottom matched a name I had seen entangled in my company's contracts. My chest punched the air like a trapped animal. "I don't sell myself," he said, his face flat in the moonlight, "but I do collect what is left behind." He had been gathering scraps, emails, shipping manifests, receipts that showed contractors paid for safety audits that never happened. He kept things because memory needed witnesses, not because he had any idea when those scraps might matter. He had nothing of my world, except fragments that fit into a puzzle. I suddenly recognized the margin notes that excused corners cut for profit, the supplier lists that looped back to my own board. I remember sitting in the dark and feeling a slow, unfamiliar grief unspool inside me. It was one thing to be refused money in a public spectacle. It was another to discover that the refusal had peeled back a curtain to my family's complicity. My father's meticulous spreadsheets had always comforted me. Numbers were a grammar I trusted. Now the columns had names beside them, and some of those names had faces I had just met on a damp fire escape. My first instinct was the old corporate reflex: protect the brand, manage the optics by silence if necessary. But Lucas's refusal had already taught me the cost of buying obedience. You pay once, then you spend the rest of your life paying to hide the price. Guilt is a strange thing. It arrives as a physical ache, a weight that sits between your ribs, and then it turns into a question that refuses to be ignored. How many times had I walked past a report and chosen not to pry? How many policies had I let stand because the quarterly numbers were good, and therapists said the human cost was acceptable? Attrition. The ledger in Lucas's hand was not just paper. It was a mirror showing the small cruelties my family's decisions had licensed. I had built my life on the assumption that power absolved, that profit sanitized mistakes. Holding that photocopy felt like holding the proof of my own blind complicity. He watched me with an expression that made me want to shrink and confess at once. "You could give me money," he said casually. The sentence a test. He meant it as a barometer. Would I fall back into old patterns? I thought of the envelope I had offered, the way my hand had trembled when he left it untouched. I realized then that money had been my language for control, and I had spoken it without meaning to translate any more of my life into bargaining chips. I surprised myself by saying, "I want to help properly. Not to erase but to repair." He gave a small laugh, not mocking, and for the first time the conversation turned from accusation to possibility. What followed was not the tidy redemption that movies offer. There was neither confession ceremony nor sudden absolution. There were instead slow negotiations of trust. A patchwork of practicalities. I used my contacts to find the forgotten files. Lucas introduced me to people who had sat quietly at kitchen tables while their names vanished from reports. We worked with a lawyer who believed enough to see patterns in the scribbles. Each night I fell asleep with a new anger directed at myself for what I had not known, at the men who'd converted lives into margins, and oddly at Lucas for forcing me to see it. It felt right to be angry at everything and everyone, because anger at least signaled that something inside me had woken up. When the first full document surfaced, an internal memo that detailed cost-cutting measures explicitly tied to safety audits, I felt a violent, searing vindication that was terrible to enjoy. Evidence is not the same thing as justice, I learned. It is simply the beginning of a process that requires appetite, resources, and a willingness to endure. Lucas wanted the truth out, not for vengeance so much as for recognition of wrongs. I wanted something else too, to be no longer the woman who bought her way through discomfort, but someone who could face consequences and still stand. That combination made us awkward allies. We moved like two people learning to use a single map while walking at different speeds. There were moments I wanted to retreat, to slip back into my old polished armor and let this be someone else's fight. But every time I considered that, I remembered the photograph of his mother, propped by a teapot, the way a small child's face had tilted toward her, like trust incarnate. I could not in good conscience walk away from the ledger he had collected, or from the story it demanded be told. The refusal that had humiliated me had become the hinge on which my life turned. What we were building from those fragments would demand a reckoning that reached beyond a viral clip and into the heart of my family's secrets. The weeks that followed felt like learning a new language, not the language of profit and tidy margins that I'd been fluent in for decades, but the grammar of accountability, of how to turn scraps into subpoenas and whispered memories into testimony. Lucas and I worked in fits and starts, often separate rooms, sometimes shoulder to shoulder, assembling the story, the way you assemble a picture from a box of jumbled pieces. He brought the fragments he had collected over years of quiet observation. I pulled in what access my old life still allowed me: archived contracts, supplier lists, faces who suddenly remembered things. Once, a lawyer knocked politely at their door. We created red threads that tied a cost-cutting memo to a supplier who had outsourced work to a factory that later burned. We tied the ledger to payments that had been described as donations. We tied the photograph of a woman with my mother's eyes to a name that appeared again and again in the margins of invoices. I learned to be patient in a new way. My whole career had been measured in decisive deals and closing quickly and moving the market before others knew what hit them. This was the opposite: slow accumulation, making sure every scrap was copied, time-stamped, preserved. We used safe deposit boxes, encrypted drives, and coded labels that would confuse anyone who casually rifled through files. Lucas taught me how to read a ledger as if it were a palm, to see where pressure had been applied and where it had lifted. He taught me to listen for patterns in people's schedules. I taught him how to call a favored journalist without sounding like an enraged magnate. We were clumsy allies in mornings and fierce conspirators by dusk. There was a twist that neither of us expected, something that made my stomach go cold and then strangely steady at the same time. In an old folder in the company archive buried under a stack of procurement reports, I found a memo my father had signed years ago. It was a cover note, practical and perfunctory, approving a cost reduction that explicitly allowed a third-party contractor to use lower-grade materials and reduce safety checks. The memo was stamped with my father's initials and a date that matched the week the factory fire had been reported. Reading that signature made something in my chest tilt. The comfortable narrative I'd told myself, my father as a man who sacrificed for the company, the ledger as a distant business tool, crumbled into something uglier. He had not simply failed to ask. He had authorized a path that led to risk. Guilt, the kind that lives in your bones, settled over me like winter. When I confronted him, the conversation was not the cinematic unburdening I'd imagined in quiet moments. It was small and ugly and human. He did not deny the memo. He gave me the same corporate explanation he had given on 100 conference calls: the pressures of quarterly targets, the need to stay competitive, the calculation that a single short-term compromise could be rationalized by long-term gains. He looked tired in a way I had never seen, eyes dulled by the arithmetic of trade-offs. He told me awkwardly and with a kind of cowardly honesty that he had been protecting the company he had built, protecting people who depended on its payroll. That may have been true. What was true for me in that room with him was that his protection had a price tag attached to other people's lives. That conversation did not make me cruel. It made me more determined. I realized that what we faced was not only individual malfeasance, but a culture where decisions were measured in spreadsheets and lives were footnotes. It explained why settlements had been offered and why hush money had been accepted as a convenient antiseptic. It explained why the ledger was as thin as it was, because those in power had a knack for sanitizing paper trails and shifting blame to vendors and contractors who could be quietly dissolved. My father's signature did not absolve him from the pain his choices caused. It complicated the path forward with a new urgency. I could no longer be just his daughter and his ally. I had to be a witness to the cost of his decisions. We decided with a gravity that made both of our throats tight that the reveal had to be comprehensive. A single leaked memo would be dismissed as rogue move, an accident, an outlier. The story needed texture, people's names, dates, bank transfers, emails with instructions to expedite safety reviews, and payment records that routed through shell companies. We worked with a lawyer who had a reputation for moving slowly, but with a surgical precision that made me trust her instincts. She demanded corroboration witnesses and an airtight chronology. She taught me how to testify without becoming the story's spectacle. She also reminded me gently but firmly that truth can be weaponized by others. We needed to control the narrative, not let gossip dictate the terms. Preparing for that control meant personal cost. I had to stop speaking in public forums for a while to avoid offhand comments that could complicate legal strategy. I had to distance myself from old colleagues who loved a good rumor and from friends who craved exclusives. Some relationships frayed, others deepened in ways that surprised me. Lucas became more than a source. He was a steadying presence who in quiet moments would say things like, "You don't have to save everyone," and then look shamefaced when I snapped. He was learning to hold my anger without trying to fix it. That helped me hold it too. As the files piled and the dates aligned, so did the stakes. The company's board scheduled a shareholder meeting that would attract press and investors. It was the moment we had to choose leak to the press and risk being dismissed as whistleblowers with an agenda, or present the evidence through legal channels and let the system move its slow but heavy hand. We chose both. We prepared a dossier for regulators and a targeted release to an investigative journalist known for meticulous reporting. We rehearsed statements, anticipated denials, and planned the sequence that would make the pattern undeniable. That night, as I sat alone in my apartment with the dossier spread across my kitchen table, I felt the old anxious hollow. Then something steadier. Not the hollowing out of a woman who had lived by cover-ups, but the filling up of someone who had begun to reckon. I had imagined many endings: my father's sorrowful confession, a quiet settlement, an apology. What I had instead was the sober knowledge that truth had consequences we could not fully predict. I slept only a few hours, and morning felt like the calm before a storm I had called. The day we went public was the kind of morning that feels both ordinary and irreversible. I dressed deliberately, no power suit that could be read as posturing, no jewelry that could be photographed as a distraction. I wanted my presence to belong to the facts, not to the personality the press would inevitably try to manufacture. Lucas met me outside the courthouse with 2 coffee cups and a look that was equal parts steady and scared. We walked in together because the simplest acts of companionship felt like armor against the tremor that lived under my ribs. The hearing room filled with a hum, cameras, murmurs, the shuffle of lawyers who had practiced indignation into a cadence. I took the stand with the dossier in my hands and the weight of all those hidden photocopies on my tongue. When I began to speak, I felt the old mechanisms of control, those reflexive sentences I'd used to charm investors, fall away. What remained was a voice that had been hardened by sleepless nights and softened by the memory of small kitchen tables, by a photograph propped against a teapot, by the feel of a hand that refused to sell itself. I told them what I had found: the memo with my father's initials, the payments routed to addresses with no actual offices, the noted cost savings that had preceded a fire, the emails that reassigned blame to vendors who had no power to fight back. I read names aloud. I watched faces as they registered recognition, denial, then panic. Some men reddened. Some looked like they were holding themselves together with thread. My father sat stone-faced in the gallery. For a moment I felt a childish instinct to rush to him to demand an explanation, in a voice that belonged to a daughter. But there was a woman beside me now, older, intensified by experience, who knew that justice required distance and documentation, not theatrical confrontations. The press cycle that followed felt like being disassembled in public. Headlines called me brave and reckless in the same breath. Op-eds debated motives while victims' names began to surface in quiet corners. Investors pulled back. The company tried predictably to spin internal review, independent audit, commitments to change. Those words sound like absolution, but I had learned the language well enough to know the difference between ritual and reform. Still, there were consequences that mattered. Safety protocols were re-examined, several procurement contracts were suspended, and a few board members resigned under the weight of scrutiny. The slow machinery of accountability, which I had initially believed might be ceremonial, began to move with teeth. My father stopped speaking to me for weeks. His silence was a new kind of wound, not the sharp slap of betrayal, but a quiet frost that settled into me. I went to his home once, found him in his study, and saw how the man I had admired now looked small and human, in a way that anger couldn't easily touch. He tried to explain. He offered the same tired refrains about market pressures and impossible decisions. I listened, and then finally said something I had not allowed myself for years, that protection offered, in dollars and memos, is not protection at all when it costs lives. He could not, or would not meet my eyes. The distance between us expanded into a chasm that took more than time to cross. There were nights when I doubted the path I had chosen. I thought about giving up, about slipping back into the comfort of plausible deniability, the way people with power tend to do when scandal threatens. But then, messages began to come that did not fit the ledger's cold columns. A woman in a neighboring city, who thanked me because her sister was finally able to tell a story she had been too ashamed to voice. A small union email, organizing better protections for contract workers. A teacher who said she'd used our case to teach a class about corporate ethics. Those were the quiet, real consequences. I had wanted the ripple effect that felt like balm. Justice, I learned, could be messy and slow and imperfect, but it could also be seed. The legal fight was not a straight line. There were motions and counters, settlement whispers and threats veiled as concern. The defense tried to paint me as self-interested, a woman who used scandal to rebuild a brand. Some in the press repeated that narrative with relish. Scandal sells and complexity does not. But the documents were stubborn. Paper does not care for narratives. With each subpoena, with each corroborating testimony, the story grew less about me and more about the system that had made cruelty administratively convenient. Amid the legal storms, Lucas and I found a fragile rhythm. We ate meals that were not timed to meetings. We argued about trivial things as if to remind ourselves of ordinary human choreographies. There were tender mornings when he would brew coffee, with a care I had once reserved for boardroom prep, and then hand me the cup as if offering a small truce to the day. He never wanted public credit. He never wanted anything for himself beyond a life where he might sleep without dread that a knock on the door would mean more than a neighbor's request. His quiet steadiness kept me grounded, and if I am honest, made it possible to keep going on days when the press coverage felt like a storm battering the windows of my life. The climax came not as a cinematic thunderclap, but as a series of exposures that tightened like a vice on the company's leadership. When auditors published a scathing independent report and federal investigators announced formal charges, I felt a sorrow that had nothing to do with victory. Accountability left a wake of unemployed people and damaged reputations, and though some of those people deserved consequence, many were small cogs who had been complicit out of fear. I grieved for the complexity of effects, for how truth can cure and wound in the same movement. On the day the main indictment was read, I walked to a window and watched people move like ants below, hurrying, living, making their own private choices. The news anchors spoke in clipped optimism about reforms. My phone buzzed with messages, support, anger, opportunism, offers for interviews. I turned off the notifications and sat with Lucas at the kitchen table. We did not celebrate. We touched the scarred places inside our chests, where grief had settled, and recognized without fanfare that our lives had been rerouted forever. The aftermath has been a slow reclaiming. I took a leave from the company and began teaching a seminar on ethics at the university. Small, armored gatherings where students asked difficult questions. My father and I have not reconciled fully. Perhaps we will. Perhaps we will not. But I have found a new vocabulary for myself. Accountability, witness, repair. My mother, whose eyes now shine with a mixture of relief and sorrow, says little, but sometimes she presses my hand, and the gesture says more than any public statement could. If there is a lesson in all of this, it is that power often speaks in the voice of reason and the currency of convenience, but the cost of those conveniences are real lives. Silence can be bought, but truth is stubborn and eventually expensive. Courage is not a grand gesture alone. It is the accumulation of small acts of refusing to accept being reduced to a ledger line. If you are carrying a weight that feels like it might crush you, find one person you trust and begin, not with a headline, but with a single practical step. The world will try to convince you to stay small, but sometimes the bravest act is simply to be seen. The months that followed felt like learning to walk on a body that had been reshaped by an earthquake, familiar streets, unfamiliar contours. The legal dust settled into a slower rhythm, hearing settlements, the dull procedural clang of institutions trying to make right what had been made wrong. The public stopped treating me like a headline and began slowly to treat the issue like a problem that needed fixing. That shift mattered more than any piece in the paper. It meant safety protocols were rewritten, whistleblower protections were strengthened, and small people in offices and factories gained breathing room they hadn't had before. It also meant my life was no longer only my own interviews, invitations to speak, people asking me to be the visible face of accountability. That visibility scared me sometimes, because fame is a brittle thing, and I had never asked for it. But I learned to use it the way I had learned to use a ledger, carefully for a purpose. Healing, I discovered, is not a single event. It is the accumulation of small, unremarkable acts, making tea without thinking of ledgers, laughing aloud in public, and not measuring how it might read in a profile, answering a student's question with no performative flourish, but with real curiosity. It is sitting with my mother at a kitchen table that is just ours, and watching the light slide across her knuckles without flinching. It is watching Lucas plant a tiny herb in a cracked pot on my windowsill, and feeling oddly proud that something green is growing where there has been so much gray. Those moments do not cancel the past, of course. The ledger remains a scar that taught me to read the world differently. But it taught me too that scars can be addressed, tended, and sometimes transformed into maps for others who are still finding their way. Sometimes people ask me if I forgive my father. That's a question with a long tail. Forgiveness for me is not an absolution or a denial of harm. It is a practice of choosing how much power to give pain. I do not pretend his choices did not hurt, and I refuse to let his justification, market pressures, the language of necessity, be the final word. But I have learned that holding on to fury without direction erases the chance to do the work that follows: exposure, repair, restitution, and structural change. We have spoken haltingly and without resolution, and perhaps one day we will build something like understanding, perhaps we will not. Either way, the ledger taught me to separate the man who raised me from the decisions he made, and that separation is a kind of liberty I did not know I needed. There were nights of bitterness, of course, nights when the headlines replayed like a loop and the old reflex to shrink back into my suit threatened to return. There were also nights I felt the strange, complex satisfaction of watching institutions reckon with their own appetites. Karma is not a clean retribution in the way stories often promise. It is messy and slow. What happened to Nathan and the executives was not simply poetic justice. It was a complex unspooling with real consequences, collateral damage, and sometimes important reform. That messiness humbles you, because you begin to see how many hands, small and large, hold a system together. Pull one thread, and you change the whole cloth. Lucas and I never agreed on how visible we wanted our work to be. He wanted quiet recognition for those who'd been hurt. I wanted structural change. We compromised in ways that taught me the value of small mercies. He taught me how to keep my hands clean of the performative gestures I used to trade in. I taught him how to speak with officials who had formerly been unreachable. We learned that partnership is not perfect alignment, but an ongoing negotiation, an attempt to stay honest when the world wants stories simplified into heroes and villains. When people asked if we were together after everything, I would only smile and say that some relationships are built on shared work, not just shared romance. That was true then, and it remains true now. If you are watching and you have felt invisible, if you have been dismissed, bargained, or priced by people who counted you as a line item, know this. The first tremor of courage is often small. It begins with a refusal to accept the terms they offer. It does not require a viral clip or dramatic confrontation. It can begin with a copied paper, a whispered conversation, an alliance formed in the margins. The ledger I found did not change the world by itself. It needed witnesses, structure, and the stubborn willingness to keep turning small revelations into accountable truth. That is the work I want to encourage. I don't ask for sympathy, I ask for action. If this story resonates with you, use your voice in concrete ways. Support organizations that protect workers' rights. Share resources that help whistleblowers find legal aid. And if you are in a position of power, audit the corners where convenience has replaced care. If you have a story you are carrying, find one person you trust and tell them. Plan carefully, gather what evidence matters, and protect yourself while you ensure the truth has a path out of the dark. If this video touched you, if it made you remember something, feel something, or want to act, please like the video, share it with someone who might need it, and subscribe to the channel if you want to hear more stories like this. Leave a comment below if you've ever felt invisible or found the courage to speak. Your words might be the map someone else needs to find their footing. Thank you for listening to my story, for holding space for me, and for the many unnamed people whose names are now finally on record. Keep watch for each other. We are not lines in the ledger, we are people.